The days that followed Daniel's return were a blur of emotions for Eleanor and the entire town of Willow Creek. It was as though the air itself had changed, carrying with it a sense of renewal and gratitude. For Eleanor, every moment spent with Daniel felt surreal, like stepping into a dream she had nurtured for so long that waking up seemed impossible. Yet here he was, alive, real, and holding her hand as they walked through the park where she had waited for him night after night. Daniel's journey home hadn't been easy. The years in captivity had left their mark, both physically and emotionally. He spoke little about what he had endured, but his eyes told stories of resilience and survival. What amazed everyone, though, was how quickly he began to heal, not just because of the medical care he received, but because of Eleanor's unwavering presence by his side. Her love acted like a balm, soothing wounds that no medicine could touch. Together, they started piecing their lives back together, rediscovering the bond they had once shared. The townsfolk rallied around them, eager to celebrate their reunion. Within weeks, plans were underway for a quiet wedding ceremony by the pond, a place that had become sacred to both Eleanor and Daniel. The bench where Eleanor had waited for so many nights was decorated with garlands of white flowers, symbolizing hope fulfilled. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed their story gathered to witness the couple exchange vows under the golden glow of a spring sunset. As Daniel slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, there wasn't a dry eye among the guests. Sheriff Grayson stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with a lump in his throat. He thought back to the first time he had seen Eleanor sitting alone on that bench, her face etched with sadness. Now she radiated joy, her smile brighter than the sun setting behind her. Beside her, Daniel looked at her with the same devotion that had driven her to wait for him all those years. Their love was a testament to the power of faith, patience, and perseverance. In the months that followed, life in Willow Creek settled into a new rhythm. The park remained a favorite spot for families and couples, but the bench took on a special significance. Visitors often left notes or small tokens of appreciation, inspired by Eleanor and Daniel's story. Some wrote messages of hope, while others expressed gratitude for reminders that miracles still happen if you're willing to believe in them. The bench became more than just a piece of wood. It was a symbol of resilience, unity, and second chances. For Eleanor and Daniel, the future held promise. They moved into a cozy cottage near the park, where they could see the pond from their window. Every evening, they would take a walk together, stopping occasionally to sit on their bench. Sometimes, they would talk about the past, the hardships, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt. But more often, they focused on the present and the life they were building together. Daniel began volunteering at a local veterans center, sharing his experiences to help others who were struggling to adjust to life after trauma. Eleanor, meanwhile, started a community support group for families of missing soldiers, offering comfort and guidance to those who needed it most. Sheriff Grayson often joined them during these walks, grateful for the friendship that had grown between them. One evening, as they sat on the bench watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to Eleanor and said, "You know, I think this bench saved you both." Eleanor smiled softly, leaning her head against Daniel's shoulder. "No," she replied. "It gave us a place to hold on to hope until hope found us." As the stars began to twinkle above the pond, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, basking in the beauty of a life restored. Eleanor's vigil may have ended, but its legacy lived on. In the hearts of those who believed in love's enduring power and in the quiet reassurance that sometimes waiting isn't wasted. It's simply preparation for something greater. The news of Daniel's confirmed identity spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By mid-morning, the entire town seemed to be buzzing with excitement. Strangers greeted each other on the streets with smiles and nods, united by the shared joy of knowing that Eleanor's long wait might finally come to an end. At the bakery, Mrs. Peterson couldn't stop talking about it while she served customers. "Can you believe it?" she gushed, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "After all these years, he's really coming home." Even Mr. Hargrove, The usually gruff postman wiped a tear from his eye as he delivered mail that day. Sheriff Grayson wasted no time in sharing the news with Eleanor. That afternoon, he drove to her small house on the edge of town, his heart pounding with anticipation. He knocked gently on the door, and when she opened it, her face lit up immediately at the sight of him. "It's him," he said simply, unable to hold back a smile. "It's Daniel. He's alive." For a moment, Eleanor froze, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a gasp. Then, without warning, her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the sheriff's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He held her steady, letting her cry until the initial wave of emotion passed. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were red but shining with a light he hadn't seen before, a light of pure, unbridged happiness. "When will he be here?" she asked, her voice trembling with urgency. "He's already on his way," the sheriff replied. "They're flying him back tomorrow morning." Eleanor spent the rest of the day in a daze, moving around her house as though in a dream. She cleaned and tidied, rearranged furniture, and even baked Daniel's favorite pie, apple with cinnamon sprinkled on top. Every action felt like a step closer to welcoming him home, grounding her in the reality that this wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It was real. He was coming back. By evening, word had reached nearly everyone in town, and neighbors began gathering near the park, eager to celebrate the miracle. The bench where Eleanor had waited for so many nights became the center of attention, adorned with bouquets of fresh flowers and ribbons tied lovingly around its wooden slats. Someone brought out a guitar and started playing soft melodies, while others shared stories of their own loved ones who had returned from war or distant journeys. The atmosphere was electric with hope and camaraderie. Early the next morning, Sheriff Grayson accompanied Eleanor to the airport, driving slowly to give her time to process everything. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching the worn letter in her hands, her knuckles white with tension. For years, she had imagined this moment, but now that it was finally here, she wasn't sure how to feel. Would Daniel remember her? Would he still be the same man she had said goodbye to all those years ago? When they arrived, the terminal was bustling with activity, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her eyes scanned the crowd frantically, searching for any sign of him. And then there he was, walking slowly, his frame thinner than she remembered, his face lined with exhaustion, but unmistakably Daniel's. Time seemed to stand still as their eyes met across the room. "Eleanor," he whispered hoarsely, taking a hesitant step forward. She didn't respond. Instead, she ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him off balance. They clung to each other tightly, tears streaming down both their faces as the world around them faded away. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the cameras flashing, not the cheers of the crowd, not the weight of the years they had lost. All that mattered was that they were together again. As they stood there, holding onto each other as if afraid to let go, Sheriff Grayson watched from a distance, his chest swelling with pride and relief. Against all odds, love and hope had triumphed. Daniel was home, and Eleanor's vigil had ended, not in sorrow, but in reunion. Weeks turned into months, and the search for Daniel became a quiet mission shared between Sheriff Grayson and Eleanor. Though progress was slow, the faint glimmer of hope kept them both moving forward. Every new lead, no matter how small, felt like a step closer to answers. For Eleanor, it was the first time in years that her nightly visits to the bench weren't overshadowed by despair. Instead, she found herself sitting there with a sense of purpose, imagining what it would feel like to see Daniel again, to hear his voice, to hold him close, and to know that all her waiting hadn't been in vain. Sheriff Grayson worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating with military officials, advocacy groups, and anyone who might have information about missing soldiers. He spent hours on the phone, sifting through documents, and following up on tips. Some leads fizzled out quickly, leaving him frustrated and disheartened, but others held just enough promise to keep him going. One evening, as he sat at his desk reviewing files, he received a call from Margaret, the volunteer who had been helping with the case. "Sheriff," she began, her tone unusually serious, "we've got something big this time." His heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Margaret explained that a humanitarian organization working in a remote region overseas had recently assisted in the release of several individuals who had been held captive for years. Among them was a man whose description matched Daniel's. Same height, build, and even a distinguishing scar on his left forearm. The man couldn't remember much due to trauma, but had mentioned fragments of memories. A town called Willow Creek, a pond, and a woman waiting for him. The news hit Sheriff Grayson like a thunderclap. His hands trembled as he scribbled down the details, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this really be Daniel? Was it possible that after all these years, he was finally coming home? The next morning, the sheriff drove straight to the park, his stomach churning with anticipation. When he arrived, Eleanor was already on the bench, staring out at the water as usual. She looked up when she saw him approaching, her expression wary but hopeful. Over the past few months, they had built a quiet trust, and she could read his emotions almost as well as he could read hers. "I've got news," he said, sitting beside her. It's significant." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Tell me." He recounted everything Margaret had told him, watching closely as her face transformed from skepticism to cautious optimism. By the time he finished, tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she wasn't crying out of sadness. This time, her tears were filled with relief and a fragile joy that hadn't surfaced in years. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "We wait," he replied gently. "They're working to confirm his identity and get him medical care. It won't be quick, but if it's him, he'll come home." For the first time since he'd met her, Eleanor smiled. A genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking, "for not giving up." As the days passed, the town of Willow Creek began to buzz with whispers of the unfolding story. News of Daniel's potential return spread quickly, and soon, the park became a place of collective anticipation. Strangers stopped by the bench to leave flowers or notes of encouragement for Eleanor, inspired by her unwavering faith. Children who once dared each other to approach her now waved shyly as they played nearby. Even those who had doubted her before found themselves rooting for her, hoping against hope that her long vigil would end happily. Eleanor continued her nightly visits, though now they carried a different energy. She no longer sat alone. Neighbors joined her occasionally, sharing stories of their own loved ones, or simply sitting in companionable silence. The bench, once a symbol of solitude, had become a gathering point for hope and community. One crisp spring morning, nearly 2 months after the initial breakthrough, Sheriff Grayson received another call. This time, it was official. DNA tests confirmed the man's identity. It was Daniel Harper. Against all odds, he was alive and on his way home. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Sheriff Grayson. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something that could change Eleanor's life forever. The retired officer's words about rumors of survivors had planted a seed of hope in his mind, and now he was determined to see where it might lead. If Daniel really was alive, then every moment counted. Every second wasted meant more time Eleanor spent waiting, unsure if her faith would ever be rewarded. Sheriff Grayson began by reaching out to organizations dedicated to finding missing soldiers. These groups specialized in tracking down leads, no matter how small or obscure, and they often worked with families who refused to give up on their loved ones. When he explained Eleanor's situation, the response was immediate and supportive. One woman, a volunteer named Margaret, promised to help. "We've seen cases like this before," she told him over the phone. "Sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to keep looking." With Margaret's guidance, the sheriff started gathering information. He compiled details about Daniel's unit, the mission he'd been on, and the region where he'd disappeared. It wasn't easy. Some records were classified, while others had been lost to time. But slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Through painstaking effort, he uncovered reports of prisoners being held in remote areas after battles. While most had eventually been accounted for, a handful remained unexplained. Could Daniel be among them? As the weeks passed, the sheriff kept Eleanor updated, though he was careful not to raise her hopes too high. "I'm following some leads," he told her one evening when he found her sitting on the bench. "Nothing concrete yet, but I wanted you to know I haven't given up." Eleanor nodded silently, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She didn't ask for specifics. She seemed content just knowing that someone else believed in Daniel's return as much as she did. Then, one chilly morning, the breakthrough came. Margaret called the sheriff with news that sent his heart racing. A former prisoner of war, recently released after years in captivity, claimed to have encountered a man matching Daniel's description during his time in detention. According to the account, the man had survived against incredible odds, relying on sheer willpower and memories of home to endure the harsh conditions. Though the story lacked definitive proof, it was enough to warrant further investigation. Excited but cautious, Sheriff Grayson shared the update with Eleanor later that day. She listened intently, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as if bracing herself for what might come next. When he finished speaking, she sat quietly for a long moment, processing the information. Then, to his surprise, a faint smile spread across her face, a smile he hadn't seen since he first met her. "You really think he's alive?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know for sure," the sheriff admitted honestly. "But there's a chance, and if there's even a sliver of hope, we owe it to both of you to find out." Eleanor nodded, her eyes shining with tears. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine the impossible. Daniel walking through the park gates, stepping into the golden glow of sunset, and finding her exactly where she'd promised to be. The thought filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in ages, melting away some of the cold loneliness that had settled deep within her. Together, Eleanor and the sheriff continued working with military contacts and advocacy groups, tracing every lead and chasing every possibility. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It was paved with uncertainty and heartache, but neither of them was ready to give up. Not when the promise written on that tattered letter still hung in the balance, waiting to be fulfilled. And so, as the leaves began to fall and autumn painted the town in hues of amber and crimson, Eleanor returned to the bench each night with renewed determination. Her vigil was no longer just an act of waiting. It was an act of hope, fueled by the belief that miracles, however rare, were still possible. That night, as Sheriff Grayson drove home from the park, Eleanor's words echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. "What if tomorrow is the day he comes back?" she had asked, her voice trembling with a fragile mix of hope and despair. He could still picture her face, the way her eyes glistened with unshed tears, the way her hands clutched the edges of her coat, as if holding on to something invisible but vital. It was clear that Daniel wasn't just a name on an old letter. He was the anchor of Eleanor's world, the reason she returned to that bench every evening without fail. The sheriff couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Its words were simple, yet they carried so much weight. "If I make it back, I'll meet you where we said goodbye," Daniel had written. Those few sentences spoke of love, loyalty, and a promise made under the stars. But they also hinted at something darker, a life interrupted, a future stolen by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The idea that Daniel might be missing, or worse, gnawed at the sheriff. How could someone leave behind such a devoted heart? And why hadn't anyone been able to give Eleanor answers? The next morning, Sheriff Grayson decided to dig deeper. He started by visiting the local library, poring over old newspaper archives for any mention of Daniel or soldiers from Willow Creek who had gone missing overseas. The librarian, Mrs. Whittaker, noticed his focused expression and offered to help. "Looking for something specific, Sheriff?" she asked kindly, adjusting her glasses. "Just trying to piece together a story," he replied vaguely, not wanting to reveal too much. With her assistance, he found several articles about deployments and casualties from years ago, including one that mentioned Daniel Harper, a soldier from Willow Creek who had been part of a unit sent on a dangerous mission. According to the report, his team had encountered enemy fire, and while some bodies were recovered, others, including Daniel's, were never found. The discovery left the sheriff uneasy. Missing in action meant uncertainty, not death, but not life either. For families like Eleanor's, it was a limbo that never truly ended. He imagined her sitting alone in her house, staring at that letter, replaying their last moments together in her mind. Did she blame herself for letting him go? Did she wonder if things would have been different if she'd begged him to stay? Determined to learn more, Sheriff Grayson reached out to military officials, explaining the situation and requesting any updates on Daniel's case. At first, he hit roadblocks, red tape and confidentiality agreements, but he refused to give up. Finally, after days of persistence, he managed to speak with a retired officer who had served alongside Daniel. The man's voice was gruff, but tinged with sadness as he recounted the events leading up to Daniel's disappearance. He was a good man, the officer said. Brave, loyal, the kind of guy who put everyone else before himself. When things went south, he stayed behind to cover our retreat. We thought for sure he was gone, but the officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. There were rumors later, whispers of survivors being taken prisoner in remote areas. Nothing official, though. Most folks assumed the worst. Those words stuck with the sheriff. Rumors of survivors. A chance, however slim, that Daniel might still be alive. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to reignite the flicker of hope that Eleanor had kept burning all these years. As he hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. If there was even the smallest possibility that Daniel could come home, then it was worth pursuing, for Eleanor's sake and for the promise written in ink on that weathered piece of paper. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon once again, Sheriff Grayson found himself driving toward the park. He didn't know what he would say to Eleanor yet, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about solving a mystery anymore. It was about giving a woman who had waited patiently through countless sunsets a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, her wait wasn't in vain. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor's nightly presence on the bench became more than just a passing curiosity. It became a fixture of life in Willow Creek. The townsfolk couldn't help but notice how consistent she was. Rain or shine, warm or cold, she always showed up at the same time, and left only when the darkness had fully enveloped the park. Some began to wonder if she even realized how much attention she was drawing. Did she care, or was she so lost in her own world that the whispers around her didn't register? The children, who often played near the pond during the day, started weaving stories about her. Maybe she's waiting for a ghost, one boy suggested dramatically, his voice hushed as he leaned closer to his friends. Another chimed in, or maybe she buried something there and comes back to check on it. Their imaginations ran wild, fueled by the mystery surrounding her. But despite their bold theories, none of them ever dared to approach her. There was something about the way she sat, so still, so silent, that made her seem untouchable, like disturbing her would break some unspoken rule. The adults, too, had their share of speculation. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, liked to say that Eleanor must have been jilted by a lover. It happens, she'd remark knowingly, shaking her head as she served customers at the bakery. Heartbreak can make people do strange things. Others disagreed, arguing that Eleanor's sadness steamed deeper than mere heartbreak. Mr. Hargrove, the elderly postman, swore he once saw tears glistening on her cheeks as he rode past the park late one evening. "There's pain there," he told anyone who'd listen. "Real pain." Sheriff Grayson found himself thinking about Eleanor more often than he cared to admit. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that everyone had their secrets, and it wasn't his place to pry. But every time he drove through the park and spotted her sitting there, something about her pulled at him. It wasn't just her sadness, It was the quiet strength behind it. She didn't cry out or beg for sympathy. She simply sat, enduring whatever burden she carried with an almost stoic determination. That kind of resilience intrigued him. One night, unable to resist any longer, Sheriff Grayson decided to sit on a different bench across the pond. From there, he could watch her without seeming intrusive. He tipped his hat low over his face, pretending to relax after a long day of work. Out of the corner of his eye, he studied her movements, or lack thereof. She barely shifted, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her shoulders slightly hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. Occasionally, she would glance down at something in her lap, though from where he sat, he couldn't tell what it was. What struck him most was how alone she seemed, not just physically, but emotionally. Even in a town as small as Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone else's business, Eleanor appeared isolated. It was as if she existed in her own bubble, untouched by the lives swirling around her. And yet there was a sense that she wanted to connect, that she needed too, but couldn't bring herself to take the first step. After nearly an hour of watching her, the sheriff felt a pang of guilt. Was he invading her privacy by sitting here, observing her like some kind of spectacle? He shifted uncomfortably on the bench, debating whether to leave or approach her. Just as he was about to stand up, she suddenly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it delicately, running her fingers over its surface as if tracing invisible words. Whatever it was, it clearly meant something to her, something important. That was when Sheriff Grayson realized this wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. This woman was holding on to something profound, something that kept her tethered to that bench night after night. And if he was going to understand why, he needed to find a way to talk to her, not as a sheriff, but as a fellow human being. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor's nightly presence on the bench became more than just a passing curiosity. It became a fixture of life in Willow Creek. The townsfolk couldn't help but notice how consistent she was. Rain or shine, warm or cold, she always showed up at the same time and left only when the darkness had fully enveloped the park. Some began to wonder if she even realized how much attention she was drawing. Did she care? Or was she so lost in her own world that the whispers around her didn't register? The children, who often played near the pond during the day, started weaving stories about her. Maybe she's waiting for a ghost, one boy suggested dramatically, his voice hushed as he leaned closer to his friends. Another chimed in, or maybe she buried something there and comes back to check on it. Their imaginations ran wild, fueled by the mystery surrounding her. But despite their bold theories, none of them ever dared to approach her. There was something about the way she sat, so still, so silent, that made her seem untouchable, like disturbing her would break some unspoken rule. The adults, too, had their share of speculation. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, liked to say that Eleanor must have been jilted by a lover. "It happens," she'd remark knowingly, shaking her head as she served customers at the bakery. Heartbreak can make people do strange things. Others disagreed, arguing that Eleanor's sadness seemed deeper than mere heartbreak. Mr. Hargrove, the elderly postman, swore he once saw tears glistening on her cheeks as he rode past the park late one evening. "There's pain there," he told anyone who'd listen. "Real pain." Sheriff Grayson found himself thinking about Eleanor more often than he cared to admit. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that everyone had their secrets, and it wasn't his place to pry. But every time he drove through the park and spotted her sitting there, something about her pulled at him. It wasn't just her sadness, it was the quiet strength behind it. She didn't cry out or beg for sympathy. She simply sat, enduring whatever burden she carried with an almost stoic determination. That kind of resilience intrigued him. One night, unable to resist any longer, Sheriff Grayson decided to sit on a different bench across the pond. From there, he could watch her without seeming intrusive. He tipped his hat low over his face, pretending to relax after a long day of work. Out of the corner of his eye, He studied her movements, or lack thereof. She barely shifted, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her shoulders slightly hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. Occasionally, she would glance down at something in her lap, though from where he sat, he couldn't tell what it was. What struck him most was how alone she seemed, not just physically, but emotionally. Even in a town as small as Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone else's business, Eleanor appeared isolated. It was as if she existed in her own bubble, untouched by the lives swirling around her. And yet there was a sense that she wanted to connect, that she needed to, but couldn't bring herself to take the first step. After nearly an hour of watching her, the sheriff felt a pang of guilt. Was he invading her privacy by sitting here, observing her like some kind of spectacle? He shifted uncomfortably on the bench, debating whether to leave or approach her. Just as he was about to stand up, she suddenly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it delicately, running her fingers over its surface as if tracing invisible words. Whatever it was, it clearly meant something to her, something important. That was when Sheriff Grayson realized this wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. This woman was holding on to something profound, something that kept her tethered to that bench night after night. And if he was going to understand why, he needed to find a way to talk to her, not as a sheriff, but as a fellow human being. Every evening, as the golden sun began its descent behind the hills of Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the town, a peculiar figure could be spotted near the park's pond. She wasn't hard to notice, always dressed in a simple coat, her dark hair loosely tied back, and her hands resting gently on her lap. Her name was Eleanor Harper, though not many people knew that. To most of the townsfolk, she was the woman on the bench. Eleanor came like clockwork, arriving just as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. She would sit on the same old wooden bench by the water's edge, staring out at the ripples made by the occasional breeze. No one knew why she chose this spot, or what she was doing there. Some thought she was lost in thought, while others assumed she simply enjoyed the quiet beauty of the park. But it wasn't just curiosity that drew attention to her. It was the sadness in her eyes. Even from a distance, you could see it. It was a deep, unspoken sorrow that seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. The children who played nearby sometimes dared each other to go talk to her, but none ever did. They were too intimidated by the way she sat so still, like a statue carved out of patience and grief. The adults whispered among themselves whenever they passed her during their evening walks. Why does she come here every night? One might ask, what's she waiting for? Another would wonder aloud, but no one had answers, and no one dared to interrupt her solitude. Sheriff Tom Grayson noticed her too. At first, he didn't think much of it. After all, everyone had their quirks, and if sitting on a bench every night brought her peace, then who was he to judge? But over time, something about her nightly ritual tugged at him. Maybe it was the way she always looked toward the horizon, as if expecting someone to appear. Or maybe it was the faint tremble in her hands when she folded them together. Whatever it was, it made him pause more than once during his rounds through the park. One evening, unable to ignore his growing curiosity any longer, Sheriff Grayson decided to take a closer look. Instead of driving past as usual, he parked his car further away and approached the park on foot. He walked slowly, deliberately, trying not to startle her. When he reached the edge of the pond, he stopped and leaned against a tree, pretending to admire the sunset. From where he stood, he could observe her without being obvious. She didn't move, not even a twitch. Her gaze remained fixed on the water, her expression unreadable yet undeniably heavy with emotion. The sheriff found himself wondering what, or who, she was thinking about. Was she remembering happier times, mourning a loss, hoping for something that might never come? Each possibility weighed on him differently, but none felt entirely satisfying. As the minutes ticked by, the air grew cooler, and the colors of the sunset faded into twilight. Still, Eleanor stayed put, unmoving, almost like she was part of the scenery herself. The sheriff shook his head slightly, feeling both intrigued and unsettled. There was clearly more to her story than met the eye, but unraveling it wouldn't be easy. For now, all he could do was watch and wait to see if she would reveal anything herself.